Angeles right now. Anyway, welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. What an interesting conversation with our previous guest, Daniel Rubenstein, about what's happening in the Middle East. It's a very complicated situation, and as we were talking about, it's kind of a microcosm of what's happening around the world. We're now joined by Theo. Theo, how do you say your last name? How do you pronounce it?
I mean, it's anyone's guess, including mine, but I guess you can say Zenou.
Zenou?
Go for it.
Well, Theo Zenou is with us from the Henry Jackson Society. He's an expert in many things, but today we're talking about conflict in Europe. And so let me just, in my opinion, Theo, first of all, thanks for being with us today. I appreciate that. Okay, so now we're living in a situation where Europe, right, wrong, or indifferently, had been very dependent upon, U.S. military support, but many people would argue that that military support is waning and possibly going away. Give me and give the audience kind of your understanding or your thoughts about what's going on in Europe with Ukraine and the militarization of European countries.
Well, since 1945, essentially, the US has underwritten European security. So European countries, with the exception of France and the UK, have not really invested much in their army, in their defense, and in anything military related. Now, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, European countries have felt very threatened by Russia's advances, first into Ukraine, but also they believe that if Russia does conquer Ukraine, it will take a bite, so to say, at the Baltic states, or at Poland, or at Latvia, or at any other country on the eastern flank of Europe. Not just that, Russia has also attempted to destabilize European countries. So if you take France, where I'm from, for instance, as you can hear, Russia's hacked hospitals in France. Russia might have tried to hack elections or to spread fake news to sway the outcome of election towards parties that are favorable to the line of the Kremlin. In Romania, not long ago, there was a candidate, far-right candidate, that appeared to have been backed online by Russia trolls and Russian propaganda. So the threat is there, and it's a Russian threat to the security and stability of the European continent, to the security of the eastern flank, and to the stability of the western flank. So France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and so on. Donald Trump comes into this scenario and says, well, actually, we are going to make peace with Russia, and what that means is we're going to abandon Ukraine, and we are most likely going to let Russia keep the territories it conquered, which will leave Russia emboldened to regroup, to get its economy going again, and potentially to plan for another stage into a European invasion, say in Eastern Europe. Even if Russia doesn't do that, Russia still comes out stronger from the conflict than it entered it, and that leaves Europe very worried. So what's happening now, I think, is a make or break moment for Europe to realize Trump and the US are essentially leaving Europe to its fate. And Europe now has to unify and be able to invest in its common defense. And you've heard noises to that effect from all the European leaders you see on the screen, led by Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, the next chancellor of Germany, Merz, Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, have all said we need to invest more in defense. They've made plans to do that together, and they might do it in partnership with the UK, which is outside of the European Union, but is still an important player in Europe.
Well, okay, but there's two things here.
Yeah.
There's the growing militarization or rearming or whatever however you want to call it of the European countries, which, and you're definitely seeing that. And there's a whole host of issues there about even Macron. By the way, I love Paris, one of my favorite cities in the world. Is a nuclear umbrella because France and the UK are nuclear powers, right? But there's all that taking place. But at the same time, there's the conflict, there's the war in Ukraine. Do you think there's any chance that the European countries are going to engage militarily in Ukraine and try to kick Russia out? Or do you think that, like the United States, the European Union and the UK are going to let Ukraine fend for itself and basically have to concede territory?
Most likely they will let Ukraine fend for itself. It's almost impossible, at least as of today, to see European troops, French troops, British troops, Italian troops on the combat lines in Ukraine, because then that would be direct confrontation with Russia, and who turns the Ukrainian conflict into a European conflict at the very least, if not a world war. What you will see is attempts by Europe to help Ukraine as much as possible with the deal with Russia. And that's one. The second thing, you will see European countries probably offer peacekeeping troops. So once a deal has been made, once a truce has been settled, Europe will try to offer security guarantees to Ukraine. So say you send British, French, Italian soldiers to patrol areas of potential renewed conflict, or you say, well, if Russia attacks Ukraine again, then we will intervene, which is already sort of implied anyway in the rhetoric of European leaders.
But sending soldiers after the conflict end isn't necessarily, security guarantees after the war is over isn't necessarily the strongest position to be in. But, excuse me. But my concern, just me speaking for myself, is that if you allow Russia, or Putin, I would say more than just Russia, because Russia is just a country, but if you allow Putin to take and to violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine and just basically take that land, many people argue, including myself, that it's inevitable that Putin is going to try to take more and to do more, and that you're just delaying the inevitable by just appeasing him now. Do you feel that way?
I definitely feel that way, and I think everyone in Europe feels that Putin will be emboldened by what the US is helping him achieve right now in Ukraine and Russia. But the other truth is, you're talking about the European rearmament. Europe right now needs to rearm. It hasn't rearmed yet, and that will not take 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And there is also not enough of European unity yet across not just the EU state, but the EU state and the UK to be able to put a prolonged front against a country like Russia and to engage into war quite yet. It seems like the wisest move is for Europe to essentially realize that as of now, because of the way the security architecture of the region has been done, it doesn't have too much of a voice at the negotiating table. In order to have that voice in the future, whether for a conflict or tension with Russia, with global geopolitics, it needs to rearm, it needs to unify, it needs to be able to speak with one voice in the international scene. And that,
well, let me interrupt you a second, because one thing, we only have a few minutes here. But one thing, before Biden lost and Trump, was elected, I mean, the conversation was about, greater influence of NATO. NATO member nations increasing their security spending for NATO and basically making NATO stronger. But you're not really hearing that anymore. Now you're talking about individual countries spending money on their own individual defenses. Is NATO dead?
NATO is probably in the death throes. If it hasn't died quite yet, someone's going to pull the plug in the coming years. Fundamentally, NATO relies on the United States, right? An alliance created at the beginning of the Cold War by the US and its Western European allies to contain and deter the Soviet Union and Russia at the time. If the US is not interested in European security, there is no reason for European countries to be interested in NATO either. They can create their own NATO. They can create their own common defense that relies only on them and not on the whims of the US. Because even if the Republicans don't win at the next US election, there is no guarantee that the US will come back at the table as a willing ally to the Western alliance. More importantly, what people in Europe are very concerned about now is they can't rely again on the US for their existential security. They don't want to take the
Well,
risk anymore.
Well, yeah, which is interesting, because one of the big debates has been, okay, every individual country increase their, I think it's now what, 3% of the GDP into
Yes.
NATO. I mean, many countries like the UK, for example, can't afford that. I mean, they're having a very difficult time affording that. So if you're a country, like, I'm just going to say the UK because I spent a lot of time there. If you're the UK and you're saying, okay, either I increase my spending to 3% to support NATO, or I stop supporting NATO and put 3% into my own militarization and really building up my military complex. I mean, is that a possibility? And you look at France and other NATO countries, you think there's going to be an internal discussion about, okay, let's stop giving the money to NATO and let's start spending money on ourselves. Is that a real possibility?
I think it's a definite possibility. And I would take the possibility one step further. It's not simply investing in your own defense. For the case of the EU countries, it's investing in a common European-wide defense. If France were ever to go to war in the future, and we obviously hope that never happens, France will not go to war by itself, right? If Italy were ever to go to war, Italy will not go to war by itself. They would all be on the same side. They would all be allies against, say, a common Russian threat in this case. There is no reason for them to individually invest a lot of money in their own armies without looking at how they could work together. And maybe one country invests more in one area and another country invests more in another area, so they can be what is called interoperable. They can work together and they can maximize their buck. In the case of nuclear weapons, for instance, in the EU, France is a country with nuclear weapons. It's got a nuclear deterrent. And the French president has said that he's open to discussion about how the French nuclear deterrent could be extended, so to say, to other European countries. This is very early stage, and obviously France is attached to its autonomy and its sovereignty. But this is an important step in building a European defense, which credibly could only end with a European army. That, I believe, is the end goal. And this moment is a make or break moment because it gives Europe an opportunity to unite, and it gives the European Union an opportunity to enter a new stage in its development. It started as a military union, it became a political union, it might now become a military union. It's paving the way for federalism in Europe.
And do you think that's a good thing?
I think it's an excellent thing. I think the history of Europe is a history of nationalism, fighting each other over hundreds of years, generating a lot of dead people, a lot of suffering, and the European project at its core is a project to have more unity in Europe, more stability, more prosperity. Now, what's important is that there is democratic stability in that project, but the desire to create an entity that is above the various nation states of Europe is a step in the right direction, definitely. And I would only add this, in the coming century, we have the rise of the multipolar world order of the US on one side, China on the other. We're going to have India, Russia is in there. We're going to have the rise of Brazil, of Indonesia, of Nigeria. If Europe wants to be a superpower, if Europe wants to have a voice in the international community for decades and indeed centuries to come, if it doesn't unify, if it doesn't become in some instances the United States of Europe, then it will be completely gone. If it does unify in some capacity in the years to come, then it will be a major superpower and it will have a voice in shaping the future of our planet.
Listen, we have like 30 seconds here, but when you talk about the Europe and European Union, where does the UK fit into this? I mean, do you think that they're going to stand alone, or are they going to have to be kind of reintegrated in some way into the European Union?
Well, the UK has made its choice. It decided to leave the European Union. All the power to them. The European Union, quite frankly, should not be that concerned with what the UK does or doesn't do. It should focus on its own member states. And the UK might have an awakening in years to come that it will have to pick between alliances with the EU or alliances with the US. Now they're trying to play both sides, and I don't know how sustainable that will be in the long term.
Well, listen, I agree with you. It's yeah, the UK is definitely they're in a dance, and I don't know if they're going to win that dance by any stretch of the imagination. So, listen, Theo, it's a great pleasure having you on today. I hope to have you back again in the future. Henry Jackson Society is a really great organization. It does a lot of great work, and I urge people to learn more about the organization. Anyway, thanks for being with me. And